At dinner, my husband yelled, "From now on, you sleep in the garage." I just said, "Okay." Later, he found the divorce papers, the Porsche, the company, and the house all in my name. When he came to confront me, shouting, "Are you insane?" I showed him a video of him and my daughter-in-law doing something that. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Glenda, and I'm 66 years old. I never thought I'd be telling a story like this at my age, but here I am. After 43 years of marriage, my husband Clark looked me dead in the eye during Sunday dinner and said the words that would change everything. "From now on, you sleep in the garage." The silence that followed was deafening. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth, a piece of the pot roast I'd spent 3 hours preparing still hanging from it. Our son David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while his wife Zuri smirked behind her wine glass like she'd just won the lottery. I should have been shocked. I should have been outraged. Any normal woman would have thrown that fork right at Clark's weathered face and stormed out. But instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Clarity. Pure, crystal-clear understanding of exactly who these people were and what they thought of me. "Okay," I said quietly, setting my fork down with deliberate precision. Clark blinked, clearly expecting a fight. Zuri's smirk faltered just slightly. Even David looked surprised by my calm acceptance. "That's it?" Clark demanded, his voice rising. "Just okay?" I looked at him, really looked at him. This man I'd loved since I was 23, whose children I'd raised, whose mother I'd cared for during her final years, whose business I'd helped build from nothing. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his expensive shirt pressed to perfection. He looked successful, distinguished even. But his eyes held nothing but contempt for me. "What else would you like me to say, Clark?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Zuri leaned forward, her dark eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She was 34, 28 years younger than David, and had been part of our family for only 3 years. 3 years during which she'd slowly, methodically turned my husband and son against me. "Well, I think it's very reasonable," Zuri said, her voice sweet as poison. "The garage has that nice little bathroom, and Clark had it heated last winter. It's practically a studio apartment." David nodded eagerly, desperate for his wife's approval. Mom always said she liked having her own space. I had never said that, not once, but I didn't correct him. Instead, I stood up slowly, my joints protesting after years of hard work, and began clearing the dishes. "Glenda," Clark called after me, and I could hear the confusion in his voice. He'd expected tears, begging, maybe even threats. My calm acceptance had thrown him off balance. "Yes? The lawyers will be here Tuesday morning. We need to discuss some changes to our arrangements." I paused at the kitchen doorway, my arms full of plates that still held food because no one had much appetite after Clark's announcement. "What kind of changes?" Zuri answered before Clark could speak. "Just some financial restructuring." "Nothing you need to worry your pretty little head about." The condescension in her tone was like a slap. At 66, I was being spoken to like a child by a woman who had never worked a day in her life, who had married my son for his trust fund, and was now setting her sights on something bigger. I spent the next hour washing dishes and packing a small bag. The garage wasn't entirely unlivable. Clark had indeed installed heating and a small bathroom years ago when he'd briefly considered turning it into a workshop. There was even an old twin bed from when David was little, now buried under boxes of Christmas decorations and old tax returns. As I made up the narrow bed with fresh sheets, I could hear laughter coming from the house. They were celebrating. My banishment was cause for celebration, but they had no idea what they'd just unleashed. You see, for the past 6 months, I'd been noticing things. Small things at first. Clark taking phone calls in private, Zuri whispering with David behind closed doors, bank statements arriving that I was no longer allowed to see, computer passwords being changed, credit cards disappearing from my wallet only to reappear days later. I'm not stupid, despite what they clearly think. I raised 4 children, managed a household budget for 4 decades, and helped Clark build his construction company from a one-man operation into a business worth millions. I know when something isn't right. So I'd started paying attention, really paying attention. 3 weeks ago, I'd found Zuri in Clark's study, going through files that should have been locked away. When she saw me, she'd laughed it off, claiming she was helping Daddy Clark organize his papers. The way she called him Daddy made my skin crawl, but I'd simply smiled and offered to help. "Oh no," she'd said quickly. "This is man's work. You know how confused you get with all these numbers." I'd never been confused about numbers. I'd been doing Clark's books for 20 years before he hired an accountant, but I'd just nodded and walked away, filing that moment away with all the others. 2 weeks ago, I'd overheard a phone conversation between Clark and someone named Patterson. They'd been discussing the Glenda problem and how to expedite the timeline. When Clark noticed me in the doorway, he'd quickly ended the call and claimed it was about a difficult client. 1 week ago, I'd caught Zuri photographing documents in Clark's desk drawer. She'd claimed she was making digital copies for safekeeping, but when I asked to see them, she'd already deleted the photos. And now this, the garage, the lawyers on Tuesday, the financial restructuring I didn't need to worry about. As I settled into the narrow bed, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and old cardboard, I pulled out my phone. I'd bought it 6 months ago, telling Clark I wanted to keep up with technology. He'd laughed, patting my head like I was a confused child trying to use a computer. But this phone had features Clark didn't know about. Features I'd spent hours learning about in the public library while he thought I was at my book club. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I'd memorized, but never thought I'd need to use. Margaret Chen, the attorney I'd consulted 3 months ago when I first started suspecting that something was wrong. Margaret had been very clear. If you suspect your spouse is planning to divorce you or manipulate your assets, you need to protect yourself immediately. Don't wait until it's too late. I'd thought about her words every day since then. Tomorrow, I would act on them. But tonight, lying in the garage like an unwanted piece of furniture, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. My husband of 43 years had banished me from our bedroom, from our home, really, without a second thought. My son had supported this decision without question, and my daughter-in-law had orchestrated the whole thing with the skill of someone who'd done this before. The tears came then, hot and angry, not tears of sadness, but tears of rage. Rage at my own blindness, at years of making excuses for behavior that should have been unacceptable. Rage at allowing myself to become so small, so invisible, that they thought they could discard me without consequence. But as I wiped my eyes and stared at the phone in my hands, I felt something else building inside me. Something cold and determined, and absolutely terrifying in its certainty. They wanted to play games with me? They wanted to treat me like I was nothing? Fine. Let them think they'd won. Because while they were celebrating in the house, I was going to make some calls. And by Tuesday morning, when those lawyers arrived, they were going to discover that dismissing Glenda Morrison had been the biggest mistake of their lives. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, just like my mood. I woke up in the garage at 5:30, my back screaming from the narrow bed, but my mind clearer than it had been in months. Through the small window, I could see the house, my house, where Clark and Zuri were probably sleeping peacefully, thinking they'd handled the Glenda problem with minimal fuss. They had no idea what was coming. By 6 o'clock, I was dressed and walking through the back door like I had every morning for 43 years. The house felt different now, like I was visiting someone else's home instead of entering my own. Zuri's influence was everywhere. The expensive throw pillows I'd never chosen, the abstract art that replaced my family photos, the designer coffee maker that had replaced my reliable old one. Clark was already at the kitchen table, reading his newspaper and drinking coffee from a mug I didn't recognize. He looked up when I entered, and for just a moment, I saw something that might have been guilt flash across his face. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, moving toward the coffee maker. "Glenda." He cleared his throat. "About last night." I waited, but he didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he folded his newspaper with more force than necessary and stood up. "The lawyers will be here at 10, he said. "Margaret Patterson and her associate. They'll need to go over some paperwork with you." Margaret Patterson. The same name I'd heard him mention on that phone call. How convenient that she was coming here instead of meeting at an office. How thoughtful that they were bringing the documents to me instead of asking me to travel. Of course, I said, pouring my coffee. What kind of paperwork? Clark's jaw tightened. Just some updates to our financial arrangements, property transfers, that sort of thing. Nothing complicated. Nothing complicated. Property transfers. My stomach clenched, but I kept my voice steady. I see. Should I have my own lawyer present? The question clearly surprised him. Clark had always handled our legal affairs, made all the financial decisions, signed all the important papers. The idea that I might want independent representation was foreign to him. That's not necessary, he said quickly. Margaret will explain everything. It's all very straightforward. Straightforward, like sleeping in the garage was straightforward. Like being excluded from conversations about my own financial future was straightforward. If you say so, I replied, taking a sip of coffee that tasted like betrayal. Clark left for his office 20 minutes later, kissing my cheek like we were still the loving couple we'd once been. His touch made my skin crawl, but I smiled and waved goodbye like the obedient wife I was supposed to be. The moment his truck disappeared down the driveway, I was on the phone. Margaret Chen's office, came the crisp voice of her secretary. This is Glenda Morrison. I need to speak with Margaret immediately. It's urgent. Within minutes, Margaret's calm, professional voice was on the line. Glenda, what's happened? I told her everything. The garage ultimatum. The lawyers coming today. The property transfers Clark had mentioned. As I spoke, I could hear Margaret taking notes, her pen scratching against paper with increasing urgency. Glenda, listen to me very carefully, she said when I finished. Do not sign anything today. I don't care what they tell you, what they threaten, what they promise. You sign nothing until I review every document. But what if Clark gets suspicious? Let him be suspicious. Right now, we need to protect your assets before they disappear entirely. Can you get to my office this afternoon? I glanced at the clock. 8:15. The enemy lawyers would arrive in less than 2 hours. Yes. But Margaret, there's something else. I think they've been planning this for months. Maybe longer. What makes you say that? I told her about the phone calls, the file searching, Zuri's strange behavior. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Glenda, I need you to understand something. What you're describing sounds like a coordinated effort to isolate you financially and legally. If I'm right, today's meeting isn't about updates or transfers. It's about getting you to sign away your rights to everything you own. The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat down heavily in Clark's chair, staring at the family photo on his desk. David and Zuri on their wedding day. All smiles and promises. Clark had his arm around me, and I was beaming with pride at my beautiful family. How naive I'd been. What do? I whispered. You play along until this afternoon. Be the confused, compliant wife they expect you to be. But remember everything they say. Take mental notes of every document they show you. And whatever happens, do not sign anything. After hanging up with Margaret, I had an hour and a half to prepare. I made myself busy with the normal Monday morning tasks, starting a load of laundry, planning dinner, dusting the living room, but my mind was racing, cataloging every injustice, every small cruelty, every moment over the past year when I'd felt something was wrong but dismissed my own instincts. The irony wasn't lost on me. For decades, I'd prided myself on being the perfect wife, the supportive partner who never questioned her husband's decisions. I'd believed that trust and submission were virtues, that a good marriage meant never challenging your spouse's authority. Now I realized that my compliance had been seen as weakness. My trust had been interpreted as stupidity. My love had been mistaken for desperation. At 9:30, a sleek black sedan pulled into the driveway. 2 women emerged, one in her 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit, the other younger with a briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Margaret Patterson looked exactly like what she was, a predator in designer clothing. Clark arrived 30 seconds after them, as if he'd been waiting around the corner for their arrival. The coordination was impressive and sickening. Glenda, he called as they approached the front door. Come meet Margaret and her associate, Jessica. I opened the door with my best smile, the one I'd perfected over decades of playing hostess to Clark's business associates and friends. "How lovely to meet you both," I said warmly. "Please come in. Can I offer you coffee? Tea?" Margaret Patterson studied me with sharp eyes, clearly assessing whether I would be a problem or a pushover. I made sure she saw exactly what she expected. A gray-haired woman in a simple sweater and slacks, no makeup, no jewelry except my wedding ring. Harmless. Insignificant. "Coffee would be wonderful," Margaret said smoothly. "Clark has told us so much about you." I'm sure he had. None of it good, I suspected. As I busied myself in the kitchen, I could hear them setting up in the dining room. Papers rustling, briefcases clicking open, voices murmuring in consultation. They were preparing for battle, and they thought I was already defeated. But as I arranged coffee cups on a tray, I caught sight of my reflection in the microwave door. The woman looking back at me wasn't the defeated victim they expected. Her eyes were alert, calculating. She looked like someone who had spent 43 years learning her opponent's weaknesses and was finally ready to use that knowledge. When I brought the coffee tray to the dining room, the transformation was complete. The space where my family usually shared meals had become a war room, with documents spread across the polished wood surface, and Margaret Patterson sitting where I usually sat, as if she already owned the place. "Please, sit," Margaret said, gesturing to the chair at the far end of the table, the position of least power, furthest from the action. They'd even choreographed my humiliation. I sat down quietly, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for them to begin their assault. But inside, I was already 3 steps ahead, planning my counterattack. Because tonight, after they'd congratulated themselves on manipulating the helpless old woman, I would be sitting in Margaret Chen's office, signing papers of my own. Papers that would turn their victory into the biggest mistake of their lives. But first, I had to survive whatever they were about to throw at me, and I had to do it while appearing to be exactly what they thought I was: weak, confused, and completely under their control. "Now, Glenda," Margaret Patterson began, her voice dripping with false kindness, "what we're going to discuss today is really for your own protection." I nodded dutifully, my hands folded in my lap like a schoolgirl waiting for instruction. Clark sat beside Margaret, his face a mask of concern that might have fooled me 6 months ago. Now I could see it for what it was, barely contained impatience mixed with guilt. "As women age," Margaret continued, "financial management can become overwhelming. Complex investments, tax implications, property maintenance. It's really quite a burden." The condescension was so thick I could practically taste it. This woman, who had never met me before today, was explaining to me that my 66-year-old brain was too feeble to handle money. The same brain that had managed household budgets, raised 4 children, and helped build Clark's business from nothing. "I suppose that's true," I said softly, playing my part perfectly. Jessica, the younger lawyer, spread several documents across the table. "What we're proposing is a simplified arrangement. Clark will assume full responsibility for all financial matters, and you'll be provided with a comfortable monthly allowance for personal expenses." An allowance. Like I was a child receiving pocket money. "How much of an allowance?" I asked, as if the amount mattered more than the principle. $800 per month, Clark said quickly. "More than enough for your needs." $800. I spent more than that on groceries alone, but I smiled and nodded as if this was generous. "And the house?" I asked innocently. Margaret's smile became sharper. "The property will be transferred into a trust, with Clark as the primary trustee. This protects the asset from potential creditors and ensures proper maintenance." Translation: they were stealing my house and making it sound like a favor. "What about when Clark passes away?" I asked, maintaining my worried wife tone. "The trust provides for your care in an appropriate facility," Jessica said smoothly. "Assisted living, or whatever level of care becomes necessary. A facility. They were planning to ship me off to die in some nursing home while they divided up everything I'd helped build." But the real revelation came when Margaret pulled out the final document. "This last item is just a precautionary measure," she said, sliding a thick packet toward me. "It's a power of attorney designation, allowing Clark to make medical and financial decisions on your behalf should you become." Incapacitated. My blood turned to ice. I knew exactly what this was. A document that would give Clark complete control over my life. He could have me declared incompetent, commit me to a psychiatric facility, or worse, all with the stroke of a pen. What kind of incapacitation? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clark leaned forward, his face a picture of husbandly concern. Well, honey, you've been so forgetful lately. Just last week you couldn't remember where you put your reading glasses, and you've been getting confused about simple things. Forgetful, confused. I hadn't been either of those things, but I understood now how they planned to justify what came next. The important thing, Margaret added, is that everything is in place to protect you when these issues inevitably worsen. When, not if. They weren't just planning for my possible decline, they were planning to cause it. I stared at the documents, my mind racing. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about erasing me completely, turning me into a legal non-person who could be controlled, medicated, or disposed of as they saw fit. I need to think about this, I said slowly. Clark's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger underneath. Glenda, we've explained everything. It's all very straightforward. I know, but it's a lot to take in. Could I have until tomorrow to review everything? Margaret's smile became brittle. Of course, but I should mention that there are some time-sensitive elements here. Tax advantages that expire at the end of the month, that sort of thing. It was October 15th. They were trying to pressure me into signing by claiming I only had 2 weeks to decide about documents that would control the rest of my life. I understand, I said, standing up carefully. Thank you so much for taking the time to explain everything. The lawyers exchanged glances. This wasn't going according to their script. They'd expected me to sign immediately, overwhelmed by legal jargon and frightened by talk of my declining mental state. Glenda, Clark said sharply, sit back down. We need to finish this today. For the first time, I let a little steel show in my voice. Clark, I said I need time to think. Surely 24 hours isn't unreasonable for decisions this important. The room fell silent. Clark's face flushed red. He wasn't used to me contradicting him, especially in front of strangers. Margaret studied me with new interest, clearly reassessing her initial impression. Of course, Margaret said finally. We'll be in touch tomorrow. After they left, Clark cornered me in the kitchen. What the hell was that about? What do you mean? Don't play dumb with me, Glenda. You embarrassed me in there. I turned to face him. This man I'd loved for over 4 decades. I embarrassed you by asking for time to think about signing away my rights to everything I own? Your rights? Clark laughed harshly. Glenda, you haven't contributed anything to this marriage in years. I built the business. I paid for this house. I made the investments. You just existed. The cruelty of it took my breath away. 43 years of marriage, 4 children, countless sacrifices, and I had just existed. I see, I said quietly. Do you? Because I'm not sure you understand how precarious your position is here. You have no income, no assets in your name, no one who would take you in if I decided I'd had enough. The threat was crystal clear. Sign the documents or be thrown out with nothing. I understand perfectly, I said. Clark studied my face, looking for signs of capitulation. When he didn't find them, his expression hardened. Good, because tomorrow morning, you're going to sign those papers, all of them, and then we're going to discuss some new house rules. He left me standing in the kitchen, my hands shaking with rage, and something else, fear, because I finally understood what I was really dealing with. This wasn't just about greed or even cruelty. Clark and Zuri were planning something far worse than financial theft. They were planning to erase me completely. That afternoon, while Clark was at his office and Zuri was out spending money we couldn't afford, I drove to Margaret Chen's law firm. The building was modest compared to the gleaming tower where Margaret Patterson worked, but I felt safer the moment I walked through the door. Margaret Chen was everything her predatory namesake wasn't. Warm, genuine, and fiercely intelligent. She listened without interruption as I described the morning's meeting, taking notes and occasionally asking pointed questions. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, her expression grim. Glenda, what they're asking you to sign isn't just asset transfer. It's a blueprint for elder abuse. The power of attorney, combined with the financial arrangements, would give Clark complete control over your life. What happens if I refuse to sign? Based on what you've told me, they'll probably try to have you declared incompetent. They'll claim you're showing signs of dementia, that you're a danger to yourself. With a compliant doctor and the right legal maneuvering, they could have you committed for evaluation and take control of your affairs that way. The room seemed to spin around me. But I'm not incompetent. I'm not showing any signs of dementia. That won't matter if they can create a convincing narrative. A few carefully documented incidents, some testimony from concerned family members, a psychiatric evaluation from the right doctor. It's easier than you'd think. I felt sick. So what do? Margaret opened a file cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. We fight back. But first, we need to protect what's yours before they can steal it. For the next 2 hours, Margaret walked me through a series of documents that would secure my future and expose their scheme. Power of attorney revocations, asset protection trusts, even a new will that would ensure Clark couldn't inherit anything if something happened to me. The key, Margaret explained, is that we do this quietly. If they realize you're fighting back before we're ready, they might accelerate their timeline. As I signed document after document, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't just reacting to their attacks. I was taking control. There's one more thing, Margaret said as we finished. You mentioned that your daughter-in-law has been photographing documents and searching through files. I think we should find out exactly what she was looking for. She handed me a small device that looked like a pen. This is a recording device. If they try to pressure you again, or if they reveal more of their plan, we'll want evidence. Driving home, I felt like a different person than the woman who had woken up in the garage that morning. I was no longer the victim in this story. I was the avenging angel. And tomorrow, Clark and his accomplices were going to discover just how wrong they'd been about me. But first, I needed to survive one more night in their house, surrounded by people who were planning to destroy me. And I needed to do it while they still believed I was the helpless old woman they could manipulate at will. The hardest part wouldn't be fooling them. The hardest part would be restraining myself from revealing just how badly they'd underestimated Glenda Morrison. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually lifted my spirits. Today, however, it felt like the calm before a hurricane. I woke up in the garage at 5 o'clock, my body aching from another night on the narrow bed, but my mind sharp as a blade. Today was the day Clark expected me to sign away my life. Instead, it would be the day he discovered that his compliant little wife had vanished forever. I went through my normal morning routine, making coffee and breakfast as if nothing had changed. Clark came down at 7:30, already dressed in his best suit, the navy one I'd bought him for our 40th anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, setting a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. He grunted in response, his attention focused on his phone. I could see him texting someone, probably Margaret Patterson, confirming that today's signing would go smoothly. "What time are they coming?" I asked, playing the part of the anxious wife one last time. 10 o'clock. And Glenda? Clark looked up at me, his eyes cold. "I don't want a repeat of yesterday's performance. You're going to sign those papers without any more questions or delays." "Of course," I said softly. "I understand now." I did understand. I understood that the man I'd married no longer existed, if he ever had. I understood that Zuri had been planning this from the moment she walked into our family. And I understood that if I didn't fight back today, I might never get another chance. At 9:45, I excused myself to freshen up. In the bathroom, I activated the recording device Margaret had given me, slipping it into the pocket of my cardigan. My hands were steady as I applied lipstick and combed my hair. The woman in the mirror looked calm, even serene. She looked like someone who was about to deliver justice. The lawyers arrived precisely at 10, followed moments later by Zuri. She swept into the house like she owned it, which I suppose she thought she soon would. Good morning, Glenda, she said with false warmth. I hope you slept well. In the garage, she meant, on the narrow bed, like a servant banished from the main house. Very well, thank you, I replied. We gathered in the dining room again, the same setup as yesterday. Margaret Patterson spread the documents across the table with the confidence of someone who believed victory was assured. I trust you've had time to consider everything we discussed yesterday, Margaret said. Oh, yes. I've thought about it very carefully. Clark leaned forward. Good. Then let's get this done. Margaret pulled out an expensive pen and placed it next to the first document. We'll start with the power of attorney. This ensures that Clark can take care of all the complicated financial and medical decisions. I picked up the pen, noting how they all relaxed slightly. Even Zuri smiled, probably already mentally redecorating my house. Before I sign, I said quietly, could you explain once more what happens to my assets under this arrangement? Margaret's smile tightened slightly. As we discussed, everything will be protected in trust. Clark will manage the investments, maintain the properties, ensure your care. And if Clark predeceases me, the trust has provisions for that contingency, Jessica said smoothly. Your son David would assume management responsibilities. David, who was completely under Zuri's control, how convenient. What about my other children? I asked. Clark shifted uncomfortably. Glenda, we've been through this. David is the most financially responsible. He'll take care of everything. I see. I set the pen down carefully. And this power of attorney, it gives Clark the right to make medical decisions for me? Only if you become incapacitated, Margaret assured me. How is incapacitation determined? By medical professionals, of course. If you develop dementia or other cognitive issues that impair your judgment. What if I disagree with their assessment? The question clearly irritated Clark. Glenda, why would you disagree? If doctors say you're not capable of making decisions, then you're not capable. But what if the doctors are wrong? What if someone convinced them I was incompetent when I wasn't? Silence fell over the room. Margaret's professional smile wavered slightly. That's a very unlikely scenario, she said carefully. Is it? Because yesterday Clark told me I've been forgetful and confused lately, but I haven't been. I remember everything perfectly. Clark's face flushed. You're being paranoid. Am I? Or am I being careful? I picked up the power of attorney document and read aloud. This instrument grants broad authority over the principal's medical care, including the right to authorize psychiatric treatment and commitment to care facilities. The room was dead silent now. Zuri's smile had completely disappeared. In other words, I continued, once I sign this, Clark could have me committed to a psychiatric facility against my will, even if I'm perfectly healthy. Glenda, Margaret said sharply, you're misinterpreting the legal language. Am I? Because it seems very clear to me. Clark gets control of all my money, all my property, and the legal right to lock me away if I object. Clark slammed his hand on the table. Enough. You're going to sign those papers right now, or what? I asked calmly. You'll throw me out? Have me committed? Claim I'm having a breakdown? The mask had finally slipped completely. Clark's face was twisted with rage, and Zuri looked like she wanted to scratch my eyes out. You think you're so smart, Zuri hissed, but you're just a bitter old woman with no friends, no money, and no options. You're right about one thing, I said, standing up slowly. I was bitter. I was also blind and foolish and far too trusting. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. But I'm not stupid. Clark's eyes fixed on the envelope like it was a snake. What is that? Copies of documents I found in your study Sunday night while you were all celebrating my banishment. I spread the papers across the table, watching their faces turn pale, bank statements showing transfers to accounts I'd never seen, property deeds being prepared with only Clark's name, and most damning of all, a contract with a private psychiatric facility in Nevada, dated 3 weeks ago. This is a commitment order, I said, holding up the last document. pre-signed and ready to be executed. All it needed was a doctor's signature declaring me mentally incompetent. Margaret Patterson was staring at the papers like they were evidence of murder, which, in a way, they were, evidence of the planned murder of my legal identity. "Where did you get these?" Clark demanded. "From your locked file cabinet." "The one you thought I didn't know the combination to?" I smiled coldly. "Our wedding anniversary, Clark. Very romantic." Zuri finally found her voice. "You can't prove anything. Those documents could be forgeries. Could they? Then I'm sure you won't mind if I share them with the police, and the State Attorney General's office, and the Adult Protective Services Division." The color drained from her face. "But that's not even the best part," I continued, pulling out another envelope. "This is." I opened it and spread out a new set of documents. Property deeds, all in my name only. Bank account transfers, all to accounts Clark can't access. And my personal favorite, a new will that leaves everything to my other 3 children, with specific clauses preventing Clark from inheriting anything. Clark grabbed for the papers, but I pulled them back. "All filed yesterday afternoon with my attorney Margaret Chen, not Patterson, Chen, along with restraining orders preventing any of you from accessing my assets or attempting to have me committed." The silence was deafening. Margaret Patterson looked like she was calculating whether she could flee the country before her bar association heard about this. "You can't do this," Clark whispered. "I already have. And there's more." I pulled out my phone and showed them the recording app. "Every word of this conversation has been recorded, including your threats, your admission of the commitment plan, and Zuri's charming personality reveal." Zuri lunged for my phone, but I stepped back easily. "I wouldn't, dear. This recording is automatically backing up to cloud storage, along with copies of all those interesting documents you thought no one would ever find." Clark slumped back in his chair, the fight going out of him. "Glenda, you don't understand. The debts, the business problems. I needed to protect what we have." "No, Clark. You needed to steal what I have. There's a difference." I gathered up my papers and put them back in their envelopes. "You have until Friday to move out of my house. Both of you. This is my home, too," Clark protested weakly. "Actually, it's not. The house was purchased with money from my inheritance from my father. Remember? I just never bothered to put it in my name until yesterday." My lawyer was very thorough about tracking down the paper trail. I turned to Zuri, who was sitting frozen in her chair. "And you, dear, might want to call David and explain why his trust fund just got frozen pending investigation of fraudulent access." Her mouth fell open. "You can't freeze David's trust fund." "I can when I'm the one who funded it. Surprise, that money came from my inheritance too, set up as a gift to my son. But gifts obtained through fraud can be revoked." I walked to the dining room doorway, then turned back for one final moment. "Oh, and Margaret?" I looked at the lawyer who'd tried to help them steal my life. "You might want to update your malpractice insurance. I have a feeling you're going to need it." As I walked out of the room, I could hear them erupting into panicked whispers behind me, but I didn't look back. I had phone calls to make, to my other children, to the police, to Margaret Chen. And tomorrow, I would start the process of reclaiming not just my assets, but my life. The woman who had woken up in the garage that morning was gone forever. In her place stood someone who would never again mistake kindness for weakness or trust for stupidity. Clark had wanted to teach me a lesson by banishing me to the garage. Mission accomplished. The lesson I'd learned was that I didn't need him, and I never had. The 24 hours following my revelation were the most satisfying of my 66 years on this earth. I spent Wednesday morning in Margaret Chen's office, going over every detail of my legal protection plan, while Clark and Zuri scrambled to understand the magnitude of their miscalculation. My phone hadn't stopped ringing. Clark had called 17 times, each voicemail more desperate than the last. Zuri had sent a flurry of texts that evolved from threats to bargaining to outright begging. Even David had called, his voice confused and hurt as he tried to understand why his trust fund was suddenly inaccessible. I ignored them all. They'd had 43 years to treat me with respect, and they'd chosen a different path. Now they could live with the consequences. The restraining orders are in effect, Margaret Chen informed me as we reviewed the final paperwork. They cannot contact you directly, attempt to access any of your accounts, or enter your property without legal consequences. What about the house? Can I legally kick them out? Margaret smiled, an expression that held no warmth when directed at people who tried to steal from elderly women. The property deed is clear. The house was purchased entirely with funds from your father's inheritance in 1981. Clark's name was added to the deed as a courtesy, but you have every right to revoke that courtesy. And David's trust fund? Frozen pending investigation. Since you were the original funding source and there's evidence of fraudulent manipulation to access those funds, the court had no choice but to protect the asset until the investigation concludes. I felt a small pang of guilt about David. Unlike Clark and Zuri, my son wasn't inherently evil, just weak and easily manipulated. But he'd made his choice when he supported banishing me to the garage without question. How long will the investigation take? Months, possibly longer. And that's only if David can prove he had no knowledge of his wife's activities. Given Zuri's involvement in photographing documents and planning my financial ruin, I doubted David could maintain that fiction for long. By Wednesday afternoon, I was back at my house, and it truly felt like mine for the first time in years. I'd had the locks changed that morning, and seeing Clark's truck sitting in the driveway while he couldn't get inside his own home was deeply therapeutic. The knock came at 3:15. I watched through the window as Clark stood on the front porch, the porch he'd painted last spring, on the house he'd considered his domain for over 4 decades. Now, he was locked out like a door-to-door salesman. I opened the door but kept the chain latch engaged. "Glenda, please, we need to talk." He looked terrible. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept much. Good. I believe I said everything I needed to say yesterday. You don't understand the position you're putting me in. The business has debts, obligations. Without access to the house equity, I can't cover the payments. So there it was. Clark's construction company wasn't just struggling, it was failing. And he'd planned to use my assets as collateral to save it. That sounds like a you problem, I said calmly. Glenda, 43 years of marriage has to count for something. I made mistakes, but we can work through this. Mistakes. As if planning to have me committed to a psychiatric facility was equivalent to forgetting to take out the trash. Where's Zuri? I asked. Clark's jaw tightened. She's staying with her sister for a few days. Translation: Zuri had abandoned ship the moment she realized the money was gone. I wasn't surprised. Women like her were attracted to security and status, not loyalty. And what about David? He's confused. He doesn't understand why you're punishing him for decisions Zuri made. David supported those decisions. He sat at that dinner table and watched you banish me to the garage without saying a word. Clark's composure cracked slightly. You're destroying this family over hurt feelings. Hurt feelings. 43 years of emotional manipulation, financial theft, and planned imprisonment. And he called it hurt feelings. No, Clark. You destroyed this family when you decided I was disposable. I'm just making it official. I started to close the door, but Clark pressed his hand against it. Glenda, I'm begging you. Give me access to enough money to save the business. I'll sign anything you want. A post-nuptial agreement, new property deeds, whatever you need. Just don't let me lose everything. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered Sunday night, lying alone in the garage while they celebrated upstairs. You already lost everything, Clark. You just didn't realize it until now. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. Through the window, I watched him stand there for another 5 minutes before finally walking back to his truck. Thursday brought more revelations. Margaret Chen called with an update that left me stunned. Glenda, we've been investigating Zuri's background, and what we found is disturbing. I settled into my favorite chair, the one in my living room, in my house, where I belonged. What did you find? Zuri Morrison isn't her real name. She was born Zara Matsumoto in Sacramento, California. She's been married twice before, both times to men significantly older and wealthier than herself. My blood ran cold. What happened to those marriages? The first husband died in a car accident 2 years after their wedding. She inherited everything. The second husband was declared mentally incompetent and committed to a care facility. He died there 6 months later. The room seemed to spin around me. This wasn't just theft. This was a pattern. Zuri was a predator who specialized in destroying families and stealing inheritances. "Dear God," I whispered. "She was planning to kill me." It's possible. The timeline suggests she moves from psychological manipulation to more permanent solutions when her victims become problems. I thought about the commitment papers Clark had pre-signed, the psychiatric facility in Nevada, the power of attorney that would have given them complete control over my medical care. Clark doesn't know, does he? We don't think so. Our investigation suggests Zuri targets weak men with dominant wives. She eliminates the wife and controls the husband until she can inherit everything. Then what? Margaret's voice was grim. Then the husband usually has an accident too. I sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what I'd escaped. If I'd signed those papers Tuesday morning, I would have been dead within 6 months. And Clark, poor stupid Clark, would have followed soon after. What do we do now? We've contacted the FBI. Elder abuse that crosses state lines is a federal crime, and if our suspicions about her previous husbands are correct, this could be a murder investigation. Friday arrived with unexpected drama. I was watering my plants, something I'd neglected during the chaos of recent days, when a black SUV pulled into my driveway. 2 people in dark suits emerged, and I knew immediately who they were: FBI agents. I invited them in and served coffee while they explained their investigation. Zuri's pattern was even more extensive than Margaret had discovered. She'd been targeting elderly couples for over 8 years, moving from state to state and leaving a trail of dead husbands and stolen assets. "We need your help, Mrs. Morrison," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Your case is the first time a target fought back successfully. Your evidence could help us stop her permanently. What do you need me to do? Testify about her activities here. The financial manipulation, the psychological abuse, the commitment papers, and if possible, help us locate her." I thought she was with her sister. Agent Martinez, the younger of the 2, shook her head. "We checked. There is no sister. Zuri disappeared Tuesday night after your confrontation. We believe she's either fled the country or is looking for her next target." The idea that Zuri was out there, hunting another family, made my stomach turn. "I'll do whatever you need." By Friday evening, I had given a full statement to the FBI, provided copies of all my evidence, and agreed to testify in court if Zuri was captured. The agents assured me that I was safe. Zuri's pattern was to move on when a scheme failed, not to seek revenge. But the biggest shock came when David arrived at my door just after sunset. He looked as haggard as his father, but there was something different in his eyes. Something that might have been understanding. "Mom, can we talk?" I let him in, noting that he called me Mom instead of the formal mother that Zuri had encouraged. "I need to apologize," he said as soon as we sat down. "I need to explain why I let this happen." "I'm listening." David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture he'd inherited from Clark. "Zuri told me things about you, things that made me think. She said you were becoming paranoid, that you were hiding money from Dad, that you were planning to disinherit me. And you believed her?" She had evidence. Bank statements that showed accounts Dad didn't know about. Phone recordings where you supposedly talked about how you resented supporting the family. My heart sank. "David, those were fabrications. I know that now. The FBI showed me how easy it is to create fake documents, to manipulate recordings. But at the time, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. I thought my own mother was trying to destroy our family." "So you decided to destroy me first." David flinched. "I thought I was protecting Dad, protecting our future. Zuri convinced me that you were planning something terrible and that we had to act first." I studied my son's face, looking for signs of deception. But all I saw was genuine remorse and the dawning horror of someone who'd realized they'd been completely manipulated. "Where is she now?" "Gone. She emptied our joint account, $23,000, and disappeared. She left a note saying she couldn't watch me choose you over her. And what did you choose? David's voice broke. I chose my mother. Finally, I chose right. We talked until midnight, with David explaining how Zuri had isolated him from the family, poisoned his relationships with his siblings, and gradually convinced him that I was the enemy. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, and my son had been as much a victim as I was. But unlike Clark, David was willing to acknowledge what had happened and try to make amends. "Can you forgive me?" he asked as he prepared to leave. I looked at this man who was still my little boy, despite everything that had happened. "Forgiveness will take time," I said honestly. But love never stopped. After David left, I stood in my kitchen in my house, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The predator was gone. The immediate threat was over. And tomorrow, I could begin the process of rebuilding my life. But first, I had one more phone call to make. 3 months later, I stood in my kitchen making Thanksgiving dinner for the first time in 43 years, without Clark's critical commentary or Zuri's passive-aggressive suggestions. The house felt lighter somehow, as if removing their toxic presence had allowed the very walls to breathe again. The divorce had been finalized in October. Clark had tried to fight it initially, but when the FBI investigation revealed the full extent of Zuri's criminal activities, he'd quietly accepted a settlement that left him with his truck, his failing business, and a small monthly payment from our joint retirement account. Everything else remained mine. He'd aged 10 years in 3 months. The stress of losing everything, combined with the knowledge that he'd been manipulated by a serial killer, had broken something fundamental in him. The last time I saw him, at the final divorce hearing, he looked like a stranger wearing Clark's face. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, but I felt no pity either. He'd made his choices, and consequences were simply the price of those decisions. The kitchen timer chimed, pulling me back to the present. As I pulled the turkey from the oven, perfectly golden and fragrant with herbs, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible Sunday dinner when my life imploded. My other 3 children, Susan, Michael, and Patricia, had flown in from across the country. They'd been shocked when I called to tell them about the divorce, but not entirely surprised. They'd all noticed how Clark had changed over the years, how he'd become increasingly controlling and dismissive. What surprised them was that I'd finally fought back. "I always wondered when you'd had enough," Susan had said during our first phone conversation after the FBI investigation concluded. "You deserved so much better than how he treated you." The front door opened, and familiar voices filled the hallway. My real family was arriving. Susan entered the kitchen first, carrying a covered dish and wearing the same concerned expression she'd inherited from me. At 51, she was the eldest and had always been my most protective child. "Mom, you look wonderful," she said, kissing my cheek. "I mean really wonderful. I haven't seen you smile like this in years." She was right. I'd lost 15 pounds without trying, simply because I was no longer stress-eating or medicating my misery with food. My hair, which I'd been neglecting for months, was now cut in a stylish silver bob that took years off my appearance. But the biggest change was internal. I carried myself differently now, with a confidence that had been dormant for decades. Michael arrived next with his wife Janet and their 2 teenage daughters. At 48, he'd inherited his father's height, but thankfully none of his cruelty. He wrapped me in a bear hug that lifted me off my feet. "Hey there, warrior woman," he said, grinning. "I heard you took down a serial killer and sent Dad packing. Not bad for a retired housewife." Patricia, my youngest at 45, brought her partner Lisa and a bottle of champagne. "For celebrating your freedom," she announced, "and for being the most badass 66-year-old I know." As we gathered around the dinner table, the same table where Clark had humiliated me 3 months ago, I marveled at the difference. This was what family actually looked like. People who supported each other, who celebrated successes and weathered failures together, who chose love over power. "Before we eat," Susan said, raising her wine glass, "I want to make a toast. To Mom, who taught us that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. To Grandma Glenda," added Michael's oldest daughter, "who proved that good guys really do win sometimes." As we clinked glasses, I felt tears threatening, but they were good tears. Tears of gratitude and relief and joy. The conversation over dinner was everything I'd forgotten family gatherings could be. We talked about Patricia's promotion at work, Michael's plan to expand his veterinary practice, Susan's youngest starting college. We shared memories of holidays past, laughed at old family jokes, and made plans for future visits. Nobody mentioned Clark. Nobody asked about David, who was still rebuilding his life after Zuri's betrayal. This was my chosen family. The people who had never stopped loving me even when I'd lost the ability to love myself. After dinner, as we cleaned up together, Patricia pulled me aside. "Mom, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Are you happy? I mean really happy, not just relieved that the nightmare is over?" I considered the question seriously. Was I happy? For so many years, I'd equated happiness with the absence of conflict, with keeping everyone around me satisfied, even if it meant sacrificing my own needs. But now, living alone in my quiet house, answering to no one but myself. "Yes," I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. "I'm happier than I've been in decades." "Good. Because you deserve happiness. You deserved it all along." That evening, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and opened the letter I'd received that morning. It was from the FBI, informing me that Zuri had been captured in Florida, attempting to marry a 70-year-old widower with a substantial pension. She would be charged with multiple counts of fraud, elder abuse, and in connection with the suspicious deaths of her previous husbands. The evidence I'd provided had been crucial in building the case against her. Agent Rodriguez had included a personal note. "Mrs. Morrison, your courage in fighting back likely saved not only your own life, but the lives of future victims. Thank you for your bravery." Bravery. I'd never thought of myself as brave. For most of my life, I'd been the opposite. Passive, accommodating, afraid of conflict. But maybe bravery wasn't the absence of fear. Maybe it was feeling terrified and acting anyway. I walked through my house, turning off lights and checking locks, habits from my married life that I'd maintained for security, not fear. In the master bedroom, I paused at the dresser where Clark's belongings had once cluttered every surface. Now it held only my things, the jewelry box my mother had given me, photos of my children and grandchildren, books I was reading. The bed looked different too. Where once there had been 2 pillows side by side, now there was just one, centered on my side. I'd bought new sheets in deep purple, a color Clark had always hated but I loved. Small changes, but they represented something bigger, a life that belonged entirely to me. Before getting ready for bed, I stepped out onto the back deck. The November air was crisp, and stars were visible despite the suburban light pollution. I could hear my neighbors' voices carrying across their yards, other families enjoying their holiday evening together. For a moment, I felt a flicker of loneliness, not for Clark specifically, but for the idea of companionship, of having someone to share quiet moments like this. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by something stronger, contentment. I'd spent 43 years compromising my happiness for someone who had never valued it. Now, at 66, I was finally free to discover who I was when I wasn't trying to please anyone but myself. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from David. "Mom, I know today was probably hard without Dad there. I just wanted you to know that I'm grateful for everything you did to protect our family. I love you." I smiled as I typed back, "I love you too." And today wasn't hard. It was perfect. Because it had been perfect. Not in the way I'd once imagined perfection, with everyone present and accounted for, all conflicts smoothed over and hidden, but perfect in its honesty, its genuine affection, its celebration of people who had chosen to love each other despite their flaws. As I headed inside and locked the door behind me, I realized that this was what victory looked like, not revenge or vindication, but simply the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. Clark had intended to teach me a lesson when he banished me to the garage that Sunday night. He'd wanted to show me my place, to remind me how powerless I was without his protection and provision. He had taught me something, just not what he'd intended. He'd taught me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, braver than I'd ever believed, and worthy of so much more than I'd ever demanded. I'd spent 66 years learning to be Glenda Morrison. Now, finally, I was ready to enjoy being her. The woman who had cowered in the garage 3 months ago was gone forever. In her place stood someone who would never again mistake compliance for love or endurance for strength. And tomorrow, I would wake up in my own bed, in my own house, and continue the beautiful work of building a life that belonged entirely to me. The lesson was complete. Class dismissed. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.